So the first few frosts are well and truly on the way, and because things are getting colder and the water is changing, not only do you have to think about the way you're feeding and fishing when you go out on the bank, but you've also got to think about your ground bait and how you might want to change and adjust that based on how the fish are reacting. I can give you a great example when it comes to, say, baits that you might normally use. So take a typical commercial like here at Hallcroft. You might find that you know, during the warmer months you can be really positive with lots of pellets. You know, on a venue where meat's allowed, meat can be really good. And then as it cools down, we find that dobbing bread about, or maybe some corn, maybe even maggots, as the fish change their diet. So you need to keep that in mind as well when it comes to ground bait. And that's because ground baits come in various different almost strengths or powers, if you like, depending on their fish meal content. And that's what I wanted to touch on a bit with you today. So in the summer warmer months, when the fish are really active and the fish are looking to put on weight all the time, they're almost feeding all the time, and this is even in the last 2 or 3 weeks when winter's coming and you know the fish are still feeding really actively, stronger ground baits such as like 50/50 green, which has got like a high percentage of crushed halibut pellets in it, which are really rich in oils and proteins and fish meal. They're a really strong food source. This is one of my favourite summer ground baits. And other ground baits such as Thatcher's and Thatcher's Dark, they've got a really strong fish meal in, very, very good at drawing fish. Fish absolutely love it. But as it starts to cool down, it's almost like the last thing you want to be putting in the water, because what tends to happen is the fish almost stay away from it. They almost back away from it. It's too potent for them. You know, if you were going to use it, you'd have to be using it in absolutely microscopic amounts. You wouldn't want to be putting any sort of amount in. So if you're going to a venue whereby you probably want to be a little bit more aggressive, say you're talking about cupping in 2 or 3 balls of ground bait, or you're fishing a feeder and you're going to be casting in ground bait all the time, then you can't really afford to have that super strong ground bait in your feeder once we get into these colder times. The fish are definitely slowing down and they won't be looking for it. They'll almost back off it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a guide on our ground baits here at Sonubaits so you can understand where you might want to go with these mixes. So 50/50 is a great place to start. 50/50, like I said, is one of the strongest. This, chunky fish, Thatcher's, these ground baits have got high protein, high oil and fish meal contents within them. So they're the sort of ground baits that, even though I might be using in winter, in summer, I would be backing away from them in winter. I still like to use them, but I like to use them and like to almost blend them out of my ground bait. So let's say in the summer I was using this in its entirety, just literally on its own, a bag of 50/50 like I have done for a lot of the summer. Then when it comes to sort of November time now, I'm maximum 50% of this in my mix, probably a bit less. And once we get to Christmas, I'm talking about using just a handful of it in my mix, just to give a little bit of extra smell, nothing overpowering. Certainly if we get some frost or it ice over, I'll be taking this out completely because the fish are almost lying dormant. So I won't need that super powerful ground bait within the mix. So like I said, those sort of ground baits is what you're looking at. Then of course, as you go through the range, the ground baits have got various amounts of sort of pellets. These are all based on crushed pellet based ground baits, and at Sonubaits we've got our own ingredients that we use within the pellet. So we have stronger types of pellet and weaker types of pellet, if you like, and weaker means sort of like a higher non-fish meal content, so things like wheat and things like that might be in the pellet, whereas when you've got a stronger pellet, it's made up much more of those higher meatier type baits. Match method mix is a great example of something that sits in the middle. So match method mix has got a combination of sort of like a normal coarse type pellet ingredient, no halibut pellets in there at all, but they're still quite fish mealy, not particularly weak. I'm calling this a nice middle ground. This is always my go-to if I'm not really too sure on what I might use. Match method mix is the ground bait that always comes out of the bag, because I'm like, are the fish still feeding? Well, just a bag of match method, you're not going to go too far wrong. Again, like I'm saying, in the coldest months, I'm probably backing away from it, but if I'm not too sure all the way through the year, this would be my go-to. And we've got a few ground baits like that in the range. These sort of ground baits, the Match Method Mix Dark, a lot of the Pro range, they're all similar type strengths to this type of ground bait. And then you're moving on and you're talking about what I'm going to call the weaker ground baits, but of course we know them as some of the best ground baits, such as F1, F1 Green, F1 Dark, Super Sweet, which I've got with me here. These are all highly based upon crushed expanders. We do a Super Crush Expander ground bait, the same. Crushed expanders tend to be generally weaker. Like I said, we've got our own recipes at Sonubaits. We know and we control the amount of ingredients that go into the pellet. So every single bag, we know the base ingredients remain the same. And effectively, when you've got a pellet like that, it's a lot weaker in fish meal, much lower percentage of fish meal. Some don't even actually have any fish meal in at all. They've got some sort of a similar type of blend, proteins and things like that. And then you've got, you know, these ingredients that they're made up of, wheat and soy and that sort of thing. That's what the fish are really looking for. That's what pellets are so popular because of that. And this weaker ground bait, this is what I'm going to go to once it starts to get cold, like it has done or it is doing over the next few weeks. So I'll certainly be looking at F1 Green, Super Sweet. These are almost my base mixes. If I was roach fishing, I would probably just use these mixes on their own. The roach in our commercials these days are well tuned into this style of ground bait. So I love it. I love just in the winter, nothing more than just mixing up a kilo bag of Super Sweet. That's a great ground bait to use. And today I'm out on the bank, like I said, at Hallcroft, and I've got F1 Green, probably about 75% and just 25% of the 50-50, mainly because we're not into the freezing cold times yet. You can still see that there's quite a lot of active fish moving, so I'm not quite ready to go full power F1 Green just yet. But that's why it's so important that you think about your ground baits when you're out on the bank, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to overpower and almost kill your swim before you've started. Think about it like this. If you're on a venue where you're thinking, do you know, I only want to just tap 1 or 2 pellets in today, that's when you should be looking at the weaker ground baits. If you're thinking, wow, the fish are really loving pellets and you can still be aggressive, that probably means you can go with the stronger ground baits. That's a really good guide, and I'm sure it will help you put more fish in your net.